Welcome to Kentucky Wide. I'm Mick Sullivan.
And I'm Sarah Jemerson. We'll be your hosts for this first season of Kentucky Wide, a production of the Fraser History Museum in Louisville, Kentucky.
Over this season, you'll hear stories about a number of people from Kentucky's history, many of whom touched the lives of others in big ways. Some might seem familiar, some might not, but they're all worth getting to know, no matter where you're from.
Today's episode features stories about a handful of black photographers from Kentucky. We'll start with the Smith brothers, twins from Nicholasville, Kentucky, then meet Pulitzer Prize winner Moneta Sleet from Owensboro, and wrap it up with Bud Dorsey, a man who is a constant presence in West Louisville, waiting for the perfect moment to take his picture.
So let's get started with Kentucky Wide.
Langston Hughes, one of the most important voices of the Harlem Renaissance and American poetry in general, published his poem Harlem in 1951. It is among his most famous. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? The poem is well known today, but less known is the fact that it was just one small part of a book-length, jazz-inspired suite of poems examining the lives of people living in Harlem, New York, called Montage of a Dream Deferred. For over a century, Harlem has been a huge cultural center in America. Honestly, you could make the case that it was the cultural center before the Great Depression. Harlem of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s was densely packed with people. Many were immigrants, and many were black Americans who left the South in search of dreams, opportunities, and jobs in the industrial North. From this diverse collection of people emerged some of the most talented artists, musicians, writers, poets, and thought leaders to ever share their gifts with the world. Among them were minds concerned with documenting not just the lives of creative leaders, but also the lives of everyday people. In 1939, as America clawed its way out of the Great Depression and a world war loomed overseas, two brothers, identical twins, celebrated their dream, the opening of their photography studio on 125th Street in Harlem, New York. They were Morgan and Marvin Smith, 29 years old, from Nicholasville, Kentucky. Located right next to the famed Apollo Theater, their studio would be a home base for artists and document life and rich culture in the vibrant neighborhood for decades. Photos taken by the brothers are a who's who of Harlem in the mid-1900s. But like the poems Hughes published in that collection, the brothers were also committed to capturing the daily lives of black residents of Harlem. They saw beauty, dignity, and honor in everyday lives of everyday people around them. Harlem was, of course, a long way from Nicholasville in Jessamine County, Kentucky. Before they arrived in 1933, most of their lives were lived in poverty and affected by the systemic racist laws of the Jim Crow era. When their father was able to get a job in the rail yard in Lexington, it was a major step up from the life of sharecrop farming they had known. The family was eventually able to buy a home, and the twins attended Paul Laurence Dunbar High School, a segregated public school in Lexington's North Side. The school was named after the famed black writer whose parents had been enslaved in Kentucky before he was born. When they graduated, the twins both turned down football scholarships at several schools. The artistic side of life had captured them. It began with copying drawings out of the Sears and Roebuck catalog. When they read about soap carving, the boys were inspired to go to work on bars of ivory soap with their pocket knives. The principal of Dunbar High was so impressed that he put their work on display in the school lobby, an act that filled Morgan and Marvin with pride. Their artistic abilities earned the attention and admiration of many in the Lexington community, including Dr. Hanley, the head of the Sayre School, and Alice Hetty, whose family founded Keeneland. Both made arrangements for the boys to access studio space and art teachers who would help develop their skills. When a local photographer took them under his wing and gave them a camera, their fate was sealed. After graduation, though, it became clear that Kentucky in 1933 would not be an ideal place for black artists to find enough work to thrive. They went to Cincinnati, found little difference, and then set out for New York. When Morgan and Marvin Smith arrived in Harlem in 1933, America was about 3 years into the Great Depression, and their new neighborhood was in the midst of the Harlem Renaissance. Musicians like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Ella Fitzgerald graced the stages of the Apollo Theater and Cotton Club. Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston wrote to the world, while artists like Augustus Savage created beauty by hand and taught others to do the same. Her students included Morgan and Marvin Smith, who found themselves working as laborers in Central Park, where they helped build the Shakespeare Garden. The brothers were involved in art of all kinds: painting, sculpture, landscape design, murals, and more. Still excited by photography, Morgan entered a photograph in the nationwide Kodak Amateur Photo Competition in 1937, a contest that was won 2 years prior by a Kentucky woman named Mabel Graham, featured in an upcoming episode of this podcast. Morgan's picture was of a young Harlem boy playing the racket and ball game Highlight. Holding his breath and intensely focused, the boy was a perfect subject for an engaging picture. The photo won Morgan an honorable mention in the national competition and a job offer as the first staff photographer for New York's Amsterdam News. Brother Marvin joined him with a camera of his own, and the twins stood out. Many of the photographers and projects centered in New York tended to focus on the Great Depression, the struggles it created, and the trials and tribulations of New Yorkers. But Morgan and Marvin wanted to document the rich culture around them. The streets were filled with men, women, and children, and the vibrant photos from the twins captured them all. Kids playing in sprinklers, boys dressed in their Sunday best suits, parades, soldiers saying goodbye, businessmen with briefcases, and black subway conductors smiling out the window of their engine cars. Morgan and Marvin's photos are like the people they captured, full of life. They celebrated normal people doing normal things in their normal neighborhoods. But it wasn't just normal people in their viewfinders. The brothers, who made it a habit not to put either twin's name on a photograph, took photos of Albert Einstein, Jesse Owens, Pablo Picasso, Jackie Robinson, even Matthew Henson, the black explorer who was most likely the first man to set foot on the North Pole. From their second-floor space next door to the Apollo Theater, they crossed paths with some of the era's most important people. The theater was the musical mecca for black musicians like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, Marian Anderson, and Billie Holiday. Famously, it was here that one young girl's friends signed her up for amateur night without her knowing. Surprised to be called on stage, that girl, Ella Fitzgerald, managed to wow the crowd, launching a career that would define a genre of American music. In between, she, like everyone else, sat for photos with Apollo neighbors Morgan and Marvin Smith. On the first floor of the building, the Smiths hung photos to capture attention, display their talents, and get people in the door. Apollo stars couldn't help themselves. Practically serving as the staff photographers for the theater, every single one of these musicians had their portraits done by the Smiths. Many of the resulting images are immediately recognizable to even a casual music fan. The brothers truly put themselves in the thick of it. During World War II, Marvin joined the Navy as a photographer, while Morgan continued to work in newspapers. They always found their way back to each other, keeping the studio open until 1968, while also exploring video and sound recording. Morgan worked as an audio engineer for ABC News, while Marvin studied abstract art in Paris. After closing M&M Studios, they even added cross-stitching, needlepoint, and knitting to their skills. Several of their original patterns were sold to magazines like McCall's in the 1970s. Morgan lived until 1993, and Marvin until 2003. Much of their important collection resides in the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and a beautiful retrospective book, Harlem, The Vision of Morgan and Marvin Smith, was published by the University of Kentucky Press in 1998. While they spent years documenting the lives of normal folks and cultural icons like Langston Hughes alike, Their own artistic creations are incredible, beautiful, and enduringly valuable to the world, if a bit unsung. My brother and I were striving all the time to present the community in a good light, Marvin once said. They weren't exactly focused on a dream deferred, but they were certainly alive and aware of the explosion that would come in the 1960s.
Nearly 1,300 people from all walks of life filled Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta for a funeral on April 9, 1968. The loss of Martin Luther King Jr. was tremendous. One of the darkest hours of mankind, Reverend Ralph Abernathy said in his sermon that day. But it was King himself who would provide his own eulogy. A recording of the Drum Major Instinct, a sermon that he had given in the very same building just 2 months prior, was played on loudspeakers to the mourning crowd. Speaking to his congregation one final time, there was no mention of awards, no mention of honors, just King doing what he had done so many times before, preaching hope when all seemed lost. The funeral was a major news story across the country, but not one single member of the press invited to the Atlanta church that day was black. In the eyes of his widow, Coretta Scott King, this was entirely unacceptable, if not unexpected. After all, Dr. King's legacy had been filled with similar obstacles. Much like her husband, Coretta Scott King championed action in the face of adversity. She insisted the civil rights activist and professional photographer Moneta Sleet cover the funeral. And not only this, Sleet would be given the very best vantage point to do so, and if this was not allowed, then there would simply be no journalists in attendance, black, white, or otherwise. Moneta was a seasoned journalist, but also a human being who admired Dr. King very much. Clearly, no one was better suited for this somber task than Mr. Sleet. Born in 1926 in Owensboro, Kentucky, Moneta Sleet Jr. received his first camera as a boy and nurtured a love for photography through his early schooling. Aware of the segregation surrounding him, he was quick to dedicate himself and his talents to understanding and improving his world. So he served as editor of Owensboro Western High School's newspaper, and despite his college years being offset by a stint with a unit during World War II, Moneta studied journalism at Kentucky State University, graduating cum laude in 1947. Then at New York University in 1950, he earned his master's in journalism. He spent more time at New York School of Modern Photography before beginning his career covering sports for the Amsterdam News, the same newspaper where his fellow Kentuckian Marvin Smith had served as the very first staff photographer. Perhaps above all, it was his work for Ebony magazine that would cement his legacy. Over 41 years, Sleet took countless photos of such towering figures within the black community, such as Dizzy Gillespie, Stevie Wonder, Miles Davis, Billie Holiday, and Louisville's own Muhammad Ali. Beyond the glitz, glamour, or notoriety of celebrities, his intense desire to document the black experience extended to the everyday as well. Appalachian school children, hospital patients, death row inmates, beauty pageant contestants, activists, students, and more were all held in focus through his lens. Many of them found their way onto magazine pages and front covers. Moneta had a way of capturing more than just people, though. He had the ability to capture the mood or the spirit of a moment, like the civil turmoil and incremental progress of the 1950s and 60s. Moments which still echo through time in both words and image. Moneta embraced the latter. For 13 years, Moneta Sleet worked alongside Martin Luther King Jr., photographing many of the most powerful moments of the civil rights era. He was present at the 1955 bus boycott in Montgomery. He marched with thousands towards Washington in 1963. And on the 50-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, he said he traveled the distance at least twice, 100 miles of walking back to front to back again to document those he marched alongside. With courage, he faced police dogs and batons, rocks and fire hoses, malicious opposition, and senseless violence. "I was a participant just like everybody else," he said. "I just happened to be there with my camera, and I firmly believed that my mission was to show the side of it that was the right side." Being on the right side came with heartache, culminating at King's funeral when he captured a moment, both highly public and achingly intimate. It would be his most famous image. Coretta Scott King, composed and solemn, holds in her lap 5-year-old daughter Bernice. The child's woeful gaze, combined with her mother's quiet strength in the sorrow, reflects the civil rights movement itself: determination, loss, and togetherness. He would later say about that moment that he was doing what he had been trained to do, and that if he hadn't been there working, he would have been off crying like everybody else. The following year, this photo would win the Pulitzer Prize for feature photography. Moneta Sleet Jr. was the first African American to win in this category, and the first African American man ever to win a Pulitzer in any category. Gwendolyn Brooks had won for poetry in 1950. Of course, the photo almost never happened. No other African American photographers were present. None had been invited as members of the press. Plus, Moneta Sleet was nearly denied the prize on the basis of being a magazine photographer and not a journalist proper. However, Coretta Scott King had invited him to join the press pool, making his photo journalistic in scope and thus eligible for the Pulitzer Prize. For decades beyond the King funeral, Sleet used his camera to document the Black struggle and celebrate Black achievements in areas ranging from politics to entertainment to fashion and beyond. Sleet was born into segregation and served in a segregated military, but he marched alongside young and old alike, and he captured and expressed both frustration and elation through the camera lens. Over the course of his journey, Sleet gained the respect and the admiration of his peers within the civil rights movement. His photos show humanity at its lowest and its highest, perfectly capturing the ethos of his time. Moneta Sleet died in 1996, just after covering the Summer Olympics in Atlanta. During those opening ceremonies, the Olympic cauldron was famously lit by a torch carried by none other than Kentuckian Muhammad Ali. When his son Gregory was grown, Moneta gave him an envelope with 2 things inside. First, there was a photo of Gregory himself as a young boy shaking hands with Dr. King, smiling as his father stands in the background with pride. It was a rare, candid moment that Moneta was in the picture and not taking it. Gregory remembered that moment well. The Sleet family had traveled to Norway so Moneta could cover Dr. King's acceptance of the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize. When Martin and Moneta saw each other for the first time that day, their faces lit up, and this friendly familiarity was shocking to young Gregory. After all, one man was the world-famous Dr. King, the other, his father. But also in the envelope was a copy of the program from that Nobel Award ceremony. Handwritten on the document was a short note. "To Gregory, for whom I wish a great future, and whose father I admire very much." It was signed Martin Luther King.
The reaction to Dr. King's assassination was explosive and immediate to the lives of many Americans. As a man, he carried a lot of weight. King represented much to the eyes of America, and that ended violently in a blink. Upon hearing the news of his death, the mayor of New York City went straight to Harlem, home to the Smith brothers and thousands more, most of whom were shocked, grief-stricken, and angry. There he met weeping and frustrated people filling the streets who were, as he said, terribly lost and let down. The next day, music star James Brown went on stage for a special concert in Boston, which was broadcast live to televisions around the city. Many credit his words and actions for offering a breath and being a voice for the city's black residents. But elsewhere that spring and summer, people grew angry, and that anger spilled over. A month later, in May of 1968, the Kentucky National Guard was called to Louisville because of demonstrations and protests which had turned violent in the Parkland neighborhood. An instance of police brutality, along with rumors about activist and civil rights leader Stokely Carmichael being unable to land a plane in town, were compounded by the lingering feelings following Dr. King's murder. When the civil unrest exploded into what many described as riots, Louisville native Bud Dorsey was there with a camera. Bud knew the neighborhood well. He knew many of the people on the street, the voices behind the bullhorns, the shopkeepers of the area. Working days at nearby American Synthetic, he moonlighted as a photographer, and when he first started shooting pictures as a freelancer for the Courier-Journal, he wasn't allowed on the 6th floor, the photo floor, to use any of the equipment. As the chaos unfolded near the intersection of 28th and Garland, he moved in the midst of the commotion. Not far away, his pregnant wife waited in the car. She was running his rolls of film to the newspaper office and returning with more. When Bud's camera was busted by an officer, he was left with a sense that it was the end of his night. But not long after leaving with the film from the broken camera, his wife returned not just with more film, but also a brand new camera from the Courier-Journal, one much nicer than his own. Many of the photos Bud Dorsey took in May of 1968 are defining images of the momentous and city-shifting event which is still discussed today. But his photography career was much longer, richer, and filled with thousands of images of lives from around the world. It all started in Louisville's West End. One path into the artistic life for many is apprenticeship. A young person shows an interest in something and then is fortunate enough to connect with someone with those skills and a willingness to be a mentor. Bud was fortunate in this way. Born in 1941, Bud grew up in Louisville's Beecher Terrace housing project, and then in the newer Cotter homes. He remembered the vibrancy of the black business district of Walnut Street, with farmers markets, theaters, and shops. He went to school with Muhammad Ali, and he had an uncle who gave him a camera, a boxy, cheap little thing made by Kodak called a Brownie. In those days, Bud took far more pictures than he could afford to develop. When Arthur Evans Jr., a second-generation portrait photographer, moved his studio near the Dorsey home, Bud was offered the chance to watch him work and learn bit by bit, in exchange for sweeping the floor and keeping the place tidy. When Bud joined the Navy a few years later, he found a way to make new opportunities appear. Using a government camera on loan, Bud was asked by officers to take pictures of Russian military bases as his ship traveled through the Suez Canal. After his military service, he returned to Louisville and started a full-time career at American Synthetic. Even through his day job as a chemical worker, he earned extra money by taking photos for the company newsletter. It was this part-time work that kept him connected to his community, and that's what planted his feet on the ground in the middle of Louisville's civil unrest in 1968. Bud was just a young man then, at the beginning of a long career. Throughout the 1970s, he balanced work, children, and the loss of his wife. He started a photo club for kids in his West End neighborhood. With his growing collection of cameras, Bud coached them through the process from focus to development. He also began to submit to and earn work from popular black magazines like Jet and Ebony, national publications which often included the pictures of Moneta Sleet. Bud found success and earned extra money for the family throughout the decade with photos in national and local publications. When his job in American Synthetic was eliminated in the early 1980s, his talent earned him the offer to be chief staff photographer for Defender, a black newspaper serving Louisville since 1933. Bud accepted the job, a job which made him a near constant presence in the community. For decades, Bud Dorsey was at events, gatherings, and news moments, an observer with an eye for people. This framed his approach to photography. Today, anyone working with digital cameras can take a nearly unlimited amount of pictures. Then with software, they can make the tiniest or most dramatic alterations. Bud was a single-shot kind of guy, even when he started using digital cameras. He said that came from the day when the newspaper would send him on a 2-hour assignment to get pictures of an event with only a single roll of film. Every shot had to count, so he was careful and observant, watching and waiting for each right moment. Like the Smith brothers, a generation and hundreds of miles away, Bud loved his community. He covered change-making politicians like Mattie Jones, civil rights leaders like Reverend Louis Coleman, and his old classmate Muhammad Ali. But his most human shots are of the people he met in the West Louisville neighborhoods in which he lived and visited. People playing in parks, sitting on the front porch, singing at church, or celebrating a U of L basketball win. Besides a broad group of photographers he mentored along the way, Bud has left a trove of photos for us today. He died in 2021, but thousands of Louisville Defender photos, including some of Bud's, are now being kept at the Ekstrom Library Photographic Archives at the University of Louisville. In 2023, the archives made a call for public help. Many of the photos are undocumented, so locations and the people captured in the images are unknown. If you think you can help piece together some of this valuable history, that help would be welcome at U of L. Or if you'd like to explore more about Bud and see some of his own favorite images from his long career, we recommend the 2017 book, Available Light, Louisville Through the Lens of Bud Dorsey. The beautiful hardback was a collaboration between Bud Dorsey and the Louisville Story Program, one of the most active, visible, and valuable organizations preserving the stories from Louisville's many diverse communities. There's no better way to see the world through the eyes of Bud Dorsey.
All right, well, we want to thank you all so much for listening to Kentucky Wide. We'd love to see you in person sometime, so come visit at the Fraser History Museum in Louisville, where we share stories of Kentucky every single day in many different ways. You can find everything you need at frasermuseum.org.
This episode was written by Jason Berkowitz and Mick Sullivan, with editorial help from Simon Miners and Casey Harden. It was edited and produced by Mick Sullivan. The music was written and performed by Mick Sullivan and Ken Clarer.
We'd love it if you would subscribe or follow on your preferred podcast platform. And also note that sharing is tremendously helpful.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. This season is chock full of fascinating figures. We've got Martin Van Buren Bates, Madam Glover, Bull Nelson, and much more heading your way soon. So stay tuned.
I'm Mick Sullivan.
And I'm Sarah Jemerson. And this was Kentucky Wide.
And remember, you don't have to be from Kentucky, but it always helps.